that this lack of civics might contribute to. And then finally, I'm going to ask the panelists if they could give us some specific examples, whether good or bad, from their time as national security lawyers, but also both in and out of government, as to how they see this problem. And then I think most importantly, if we're correct in the diagnosis of the problem as truly a national security threat, are there solutions that we should look at? So, Judge Jamie Baker, I'd like to begin with you. You know, I tend to embrace just about everything Suzanne says, but I think she may be wrong when she says that I held more national security positions than anyone else she knows. I believe you get that award. You have spent a lifetime focused on national security. And I take great credit, I think, in encouraging you to join the Department of State when you were just a pup, but you grew up to be an eagle. And my hat is off to you for all you've done. And you went from, actually, you spent time in the military, in the Marines, and then moved, interestingly, to the Congress with Senator Moynihan. And then, of course, I mentioned the State Department, and you moved on eventually at the NSC. And finally, for 15 years, became a judge with the Military Court of Appeals. And now you head the National Security Project at Syracuse University, where you're both a professor of law and at the Maxwell Center, which of course is highly regarded for its policy work. So perhaps nobody more than you has seen the broad sweep of civic education, and now you see it in an academic setting. You focused on the ethical frameworks for the rule of law. So values has been something you've looked at. I'm curious to know what your perceptions are from this broad experience that you've had.
Oh boy, thank you, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is right that she had a role in my pupdom in government service, for which I thank her, because part of the system of government is having a mentor is a very important thing. And that's not what I came here to say today, but part of education is finding a mentor and learning from them about government and how it works. I think you asked me to make a comment about ethics, and this ties in with Director Wray's excellent points about informed patriotism and doing the right thing the right way. And in my experience, the hard part of government is doing it the right way. We often know what the right thing to do is, but it's often hard to do it the right way. As lawyers, we sit at the nexus of constitutional friction between the branches of government, where the politicians trying to win. Politicians are not necessarily focused on doing the right thing, but on winning. We face the pressures of practice getting to yes, the personalities of practice. Most of this resolves around doing the right thing through ethics. And one of the things we don't teach very well, I might say, is ethics. Law schools tend to focus on rules like don't steal from your client. They don't do as well teaching sort of the ethical dilemmas that come up when you have constitutional tensions between competing values. Leon Firth had a wonderful phrase, Elizabeth. It was, the duty of a national security lawyer is to get to yes with honor, with the nation well taken care of and the Constitution intact. And to understand the nation being well taken care of and the Constitution intact, you have to have the ability to look beyond the immediate moment. You have to understand what the Constitution intact means and what it means to take care of the nation. And that requires the study of history. I love the fact that Director Wray indicated that all his incoming special agents, they go to the 9/11 Memorial, the Martin Luther King Memorial, and to the Holocaust Museum. That's an understanding of history right out of the get-go. History is the key to civic education. It's great to know a lot of facts about government, but understanding how government works, when it doesn't work and why it doesn't work is a big part of civic education. I know we're limited in the opening round to 48 minutes each, so I need to be careful to limit my talking points. let's say I have two more. We can't always assume that the people in government, so we're talking about civic education. I might note that that starts with government, and not necessarily, we shouldn't assume that everyone in government knows the civics we would like them to know. And here I'm focused not on the structure of government, the what of government, but the why of government. I found that a lot of times when I was explaining the law to senior officials or other officials, they knew what the law was, they knew what the Constitution said or says, they didn't understand the why. And a lot of times when I was put to the test about getting to yes with honor rather than just to yes, it was because the person I was talking with or the people I were talking with didn't understand the values behind the law and why it was we were in that position that we were in. And so I think what we bring to the table as lawyers is the ability to not just say what the law is, what democracy is, but why it is and why that provision of the Constitution states what it states. We need to do more of that. And then turning to the public, you said you reminded that I worked for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan at one time, a wonderful public servant who served 4 different presidents, 2 of each party, which is something you won't see that often or anymore. And he famously said, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, not their own facts. And education is about learning how to critically think with that knowledge of history and that ability to look through issues, determine fact from fiction. And that's what education brings to the table, this ability to critically think and determine what is fact and so on, and to do what Director Wray said to do, which is to make sure the government is following the right process, not just getting to the result you might like. He also made the point about trust. Trust is all about government. If we don't have trust in government, we won't trust the result or the process. And then one last point is my final point. I did serve on a court, and I found generally in my experience, although it's the narrowest of government missions, the judicial branch is the least understood of the federal branches of government. And one way I sought to address that is by bringing students in to do moot courts and mock court trials at the court. And the security loved it in part, and then they didn't love it because the court looked quite different after we were done with it. It looked like a lunchroom, not a courtroom. But that was magical because these students learned for the first time what it meant to stand up in a court and speak about the Constitution, about the law, and how they could advocate for themselves and for each other. So one of the takeaways here, Director Wray is doing the teddy bear thing with his children. I would encourage each of us to find a way that we can bring younger people into our lives as lawyers and give them a sense of how we go about our business of supporting and defending the Constitution. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you, Judge Baker. You did go a little over the 2 minutes I gave you, but it was well worth it. Great expenditure of additional time. Jen O'Connor, I'd like to come to you next. And you too have had an extensive experience both in government, but also for you, the private sector. You ended your government career as the General Counsel at the Defense Department, but you've been in the White House counsel's office and also at Health and Human Services. And you began your career in private practice, but now you're with a major corporate entity, Northrop. And I'm curious to know, can you say a bit about, first of all, the tension between secrecy? How do you balance intelligence and the need for secrecy in a democracy? You saw that, of course, when you were at the Defense Department. And I think I'd also be curious to know whether you have comments about the different perspectives you've seen among those in the private sector versus those within the government as you've gone forward in your career.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for organizing this discussion. which is so important. To take on those topics, transparency is critical to a working democracy, and that goes for the area of intelligence and national defense operations writ large, as well as other parts of the government. And it's critical because people need to know what their government is doing so that they can choose leaders who do what they want, and also so they can hold them accountable. And in the area of intelligence and the military in particular, it's important to show legitimacy and create trust, as Director Wray was saying. And it's important for Americans, as well as for our allies and partners in other countries, to see that what we're doing is supported by law. And it leads to more effective national security policies. And the balance between that transparency and secrecy is really important because it's also vital that we don't actually weaken or endanger our national security in the process. Ongoing or future operations can be endangered if we're not extremely careful about how we treat information. And really importantly, people can be endangered, troops or intelligence assets or others. And so it's really hard to get it right, but the basic principle is simple. It's to be as transparent as possible without endangering people or national security in the process. And so when I was in the Defense Department, we focused on that a lot across the Obama administration in all kinds of ways. It included a lot of public releases of information about how we used military force and conducted national security operations and what the legal basis was for that and the framework for it. I and my predecessor GCs and also the State Department legal advisor all made speeches where we would explain these kinds of things. And at the end of the administration, we pulled it all together in a report. And we spent a lot of time on things like reporting of civilian casualty numbers, trying to make sure that they were right, releasing a whole range of information about operations, like where troops were and how many there were, and particular operations, just to give a few examples. And it was across all of the government agencies that supported national security that we worked this sort of basic process and goal of trying to share as much information as we could safely do, because we thought it was important for democracy and for people to understand the legitimacy of what the government was doing. And to your second question, my perspective on all of that has not really changed since I entered the private sector. But I can say that working for a large private sector organization has made it clear that a lot of the principles that we're talking about here related to civic engagement and service are very much true in large private sector organizations. Employees want to know the mission of their employer and the values. They want to know that it's going to do the right thing, that it aims to do the right thing and do it in the right way. They want it to be involved in their communities. For us, STEM education is a big feature, and our employees want to be involved in the high school partnerships, that we're engaged in, and it's because they want to be engaged in the communities. And it all kind of fits together. And so I'll stop there because of your time limits, but thank you for putting this together. It's a great topic. It's really important.
Well, that's terrific. And we'll come back to you and try to tease out a little bit more about that. Before I go to Tia Johnson, I just want to remind the audience that you can ask questions, and the way to do that is to fill out a question form online at the CSIS event page. There's a little green button that says Ask Questions Live, and that's your cue. So we hope to hear from you as well. So Tia, if I could go to you next. Once again, a remarkable background. In your case, you became, I think, the first African-American woman to be a colonel in the Army as a JAG lawyer. I think it was almost, 20 years in the JAG Corps for you, but now in the academic world. And you've been teaching both at Georgetown and elsewhere. So you've got a broad perspective, but I'd like to kind of ask you to step outside our domestic space and tell us a little bit about the experience you had when you served in Bosnia as a part of the JAG Corps. What did you learn about the civic education needs, both of that country and frankly of our own as well, from that experience?
Well, thank you, Dean Parker, and thank you, Suzanne Spalding and Dr. Hamry, for putting on this important discussion and for inviting me. I really appreciate it. The yes, I was deployed to Bosnia in the early 2000s as part of the NATO peacekeeping force, and so one of the things we do in the military, we talk about bottom line up front. So I'm going to answer your last question first. The biggest lesson learned that I took away from those 18 months there was that the veneer of civilization is very fragile, and that once ruptured, is very difficult to piece it back together. Um, as many people may not realize, is that of the what were the 6 provinces in the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina was the most heterogeneous one. And so for a civil war to erupt between the Slavs who were the Serbs who were Slavic and the Bosnian Muslims, but they all were Slavs. It really was eye-opening and shocking to everyone. With regards to civic education, this was also at the time, Lord Robinson was the Secretary General of NATO, and Lord Robinson was committed to taking Bosnia from civil war to European Atlantic integration. And so a lot of time and effort was spent both by our EU allies as well as NATO on democratization, trying to build capacity in the central government. Yes, educating people, because of course they're emerging out of a communist regime. So you're trying to do all these layers simultaneously. But yes, civic education was incredibly important because, again, as I said, they were emerging out of a communist regime. So we're trying to fix all of that stuff at the same time. The other perspective, by the time I got into Bosnia, I had done a lot of democratization work. I had been fortunate at that time to have worked on the teams on implementing non-Lugar, and so that was the whole effort to get the nukes out of the former Soviet Union. And so I was Miss Democratization. Going in and meeting with and talking to militaries about the role of a military in a democratic society, and that's vitally important. And this goes back to the comments that Director Wray was making, that Judge Baker made, with regards to, for the military in particular in American society. I mean, we have a compact with the population. We're the servants of the nation. And so it is vitally important that within that relationship then, that there's trust and confidence. Now, the military routinely scores very high on public opinion polls with regards to trust and confidence, but you have to protect that relationship and you have to protect that trust. And so it's deeply troubling in the January 6th insurrections to see the numbers coming out of the people who've been arrested. I'm looking because I don't have my glasses on, so I'm trying to read this one thing, but it was saying 1 in 5 defendants in the cases thus far were either military veterans or had some military service. That's incredibly scary. And the fact that that the seriousness with which the Department of Defense took that is evidenced by the actions by the brand new Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin, when he ordered a stand down in early February, a 60-day stand down, so that all commands could examine this issue and come up with action plans as to how they were going to address that. And so again, it goes back to that, the importance of civic education. The military is a microcosm of society. And so as you reported out those scary findings with regards to the dismal state of civic education among young people, well, that's who we're recruiting. I mean, we're recruiting 18 and 19-year-olds into the military. And so if they don't understand our system of government, notwithstanding the fact that we take an oath we swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, if they don't understand what that means, and the next clause, against all enemies, both foreign and domestic, they have to understand what the Constitution does, that it creates our structure of government, it creates our system of government, and what our role as the military is in that. And it's to defend that We're not beholden or loyal to a person or even a position, but it's to the Constitution of the United States.
Well, that's a remarkably powerful set of observations. And I suppose maybe I'm giving you a conclusion, but would you agree that you're not getting then the recruits who have the background they need? There's a remedial job in civic education from those who are coming into the military.
Correct. I mean, again, that's why I always tell people the military is recruiting from the general population. I mean, we're not creating people from whole. And so if when they come into us, whether they're coming in an enlistment, so 18, 19, 20-year-olds, or even the officer corps, so we're getting them out of the academies, we're getting them out of undergraduate school and commissioning them as officers. If they don't have that core understanding of our structure of government and how our government operates, as Judge Baker said, what are the coordinate branches of government? What are their respective roles? What is the mutual respect that we are to accord each other? If they don't have that understanding, then it's very difficult to maintain that kind of servant leadership role that the military is supposed to have. And another study I was reading that they had polled the graduates from the academies and the military, the officer corps, the junior officer corps. And it was this real sense of superiority that they felt that military service and being a military officer made them superior to members of the general public. And that's dangerous. Because again, if you have an officer corps that's in that space, that's when you start getting the thinking of, we know better. The civilians are messing this up. Maybe we need to step in and do this in a different way because we can do it in a better way. And that's not the military's role. And so both at the enlisted stage and in our officers rank, we have got to ensure that personnel are trained and knowledgeable about the structure of government, the role of the various branches, what the role of the military is in a democracy, and how we execute that role.
Powerful comments. Steve Bunnell, I'd like to come to you next. You've had a very interesting background. We've been talking with Tia a little bit about the military and how important it is for incoming officers and enlisted people to understand the structure of government. But you, as the general counsel of DHS, had a very challenging role because you sat in an agency that was really trying to deal with security in the domestic space. We tend to think of security as something that we focus on nationally, or I should say in the foreign world. I'd like to ask you a little bit about how you saw that tension between what we can do in our foreign activities when we try to protect the nation from foreign threats, and how that then works out when we're really talking about domestic challenges. So could you say a little bit about your time as the General Counsel of DHS?
Absolutely, and thank you for including me in this discussion in this program. It's, as others have said, an extremely important topic. Yeah, my experience at DHS for me was a shift of focus, as I had most of my career had been within the Justice Department, really focusing on purely domestic type issues. And what I took away from the DHS experience was really kind of thinking of the security realms in really three categories: the foreign or international, as you alluded to, and then the border area, and then the domestic, interior issues. And each of those realms or zones have different sets of governmental authorities associated with them, and different restrictions, legal, constitutional. And so for DHS, I would say it sort of fills the gaps a little bit between what have been the primary areas of other agencies, both at the federal and the local level. The border is certainly an important sort of area where it operated. operates, but also inside the country, and its Homeland Security mission, really, just to sort of tie it to the civics theme, is really focused on public-private partnerships of various forms to try to promote security. You know, the sort of simple catchphrase of "see something, say something," which you see at TSA, is in some ways kind of an umbrella description of what the Homeland Security Department tries to do in terms of engaging, ideally with informed citizen patriots, to try to build a Homeland Security enterprise that isn't necessarily driven by state action in the same way that perhaps some of our foreign activities are, but is more of a collaborative exercise. And it depends very heavily on having an informed citizenry, having, you know, it's one thing to see something and say something. It's another thing to see something and say something appropriate and useful. And there's a big difference between those two things. And citizens are the ones that are going to make the difference in terms of the quality of that from the government's perspective, and then ultimately from society's perspective. I will say one thing that I was struck by when I was at DHS, and which I've become increasingly focused on in my present role, which is in the fintech space, is the interplay between technology, civics, and security. Because I think, and Director Wray talked about this a little bit, when you look at what's happening in the misinformation space, propaganda is not new. Con men are not new. What's new is the ability to use technology to target people and artificial intelligence to leverage that targeting, and to do that targeting at scale and speed and cheap cost. And that creates a different threat landscape than we've ever had before. And again, it brings us back to civics in the sense that you need to have some tech literacy along with your traditional civics. And I hope we're able to figure out ways to leverage technology to promote good ends, not just to tap into our baser instincts in some ways. And we can make our democracy stronger. We can make our civics education more compelling if we actually use the technology, which is in some ways undermining civics. So we should use technology to promote civil discourse, to break down silos of information, and ultimately to promote more analog and in-person engagement, because that's really where community happens, and that's kind of where the good stuff of participation occurs. So it ultimately leads you to service, not just reading online. So,
well, I think you actually anticipated a question that I was going to ask you, but maybe I'll ask it nonetheless. You've moved into computer security, tech issues rather significantly, I think, in your positions after DHS. And I wonder, in doing so, I think now you're with a new organization that's talking about international, developing a new global payment system. Has your perspective changed now that you've returned to the private sector? What differences in the world are you seeing now from a private perspective on these kinds of issues?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting when you're a lawyer in the private sector is at least in my current role, I'm helping to bridge understanding of the government, and hopefully building at least some level of trust in the government, which is sort of the flip side of what the government tries to do when it's building trust from the public-private partnership perspective. And so there's an element of civic education in that exercise as an advisor. But the success of the project that I'm involved with and many others is really about figuring out ways for the private sector and the public sector to work together towards common goals and common ends. And again, there's been a lot of mention of trust. It really does come down to building those. It's not just knowledge, but it's actual relationships. And so, yeah, the world. It's interesting when you're in the public sector. Your ultimate goal is to serve the rest of the people who are in the private sector, and yet sometimes that gets lost. And I have to remind my client and my clients that sometimes it's really just a function of letting the public sector understand what you're doing in the private sector, because ultimately well-intentioned public servants are there to serve the public, and you're part of the public. So again, it's civics in a different form.
Right. Well, now I'd like to move to questions, not just mine, but I've had a couple of very important ones that are coming in from our audience. But before I do, we've only got about 25 minutes left, and I want to be sure we don't miss a chance to talk about possible solutions if we believe, and I think what I've heard is that there is a problem in civic education. You agree with that. What kind of solutions might there be? And here I would just remind the audience, I think the panel's aware of this, that just yesterday, two important things happened. Suzanne mentioned the introduction of the Civics Secures Democracy Act of 2021. This is bipartisan legislation, very important. And I might ask one of you to comment on that. And then secondly, there was also a hearing yesterday by the Senate Armed Service Committee, again, hearing testimony from the Bipartisan Commission on Military, National, and Public Service, which was an 11-member commission established in honor of the late Senator John McCain, making extremely important recommendations on how to improve not just military service, but also public service generally. And interesting to me, it might not have started out with this notion, but it clearly concluded with a view that civic education has got to be enhanced and improved. So let me just start by asking Jamie Baker, would you like to make a comment on either of these proposals or what you think the solution might be? And as you do, let me call your attention to one, I think, very important question from the public. And I'll simply read it. How can we ensure that civic education serves to expand students' capability to be discerning and thoughtful, not as a cover to propaganda? And can we convince the broad public that civic education itself is not simply another name for propaganda? So let's start with you, Jamie, and then I think I might ask each of the panelists to just make a comment on this, if you would.
Thank you for your question, and thank you to the member of the public for their question. I have three responses, and I'd like, though, to start with a chapeau, which focuses on the input rather than the output. The output is nobody knows about government, or only 10% know this or 8% know that. Focusing on the input, I'm thinking of the American historian and educator Whitney Griswold, who said in 1959, writing of communism, fascism, and McCarthyism, in the long run of history, the censor and the inquisitor have always lost. The only sure weapon against bad ideas is better ideas. The source of better ideas is wisdom. The surest path to wisdom is a liberal education. A liberal education. So point one, education is a zero-sum game. The more of one thing you teach, the less of another you teach. I was a board chair in my previous life of a school, and it was all STEM, STEM, STEM. That's all anybody wanted to learn. Science, math. Well enough. If we're going to compete successfully with China, we need STEM. No parent ever came to me and complained they weren't getting enough constitutional law or historical analysis at the school. They wanted calculus in third grade and robotics in kindergarten. And if we're going to talk about civic education, we have to realize that we're going to have to give something up for it. And we're going to have to return to a study of the liberal arts. Leadership is a liberal art. Government is a liberal art. You don't learn leadership from math. You learn it from Shakespeare and reading history. Point one. Point two, teachers are public servants, and we have to act like they're public servants. If we act like they're bureaucrats, or if we act like we don't care about them, we might get a product that looks like that. Teachers are wonderful public servants. They're every bit as much public servants as people who work for the government. And I love Steve's point about public servants can't forget that they serve the public. It's something to always keep in mind, but that's part of teachers as well. And when you look at the most successful educational programs around the world, oftentimes it starts with respect for the teachers. The top college graduates are going into the field of teaching, not because of the pay, but because of the respect that is given to teachers at the primary, secondary, and even at the university level. And then the ABA, I think, can play a role here too, in terms of what they support and how they support it. Law schools are still teaching to the needs of the last century. And by the needs of the last century, I mean the 19th century, not even the 20th century. The curriculum has not changed. And the ABA likes to complain about a lot of things. They can be part of the solution here by being as good at teaching rule of law in the United States and encouraging the teaching of rule of law in the United States as much as they are good about teaching it overseas. The Rule of Law Initiative at the ABA is the gold standard in the field, but they don't have comparable programs in the United States. So as to the question from the audience, how do you avoid propaganda? And that, in my view, you avoid that because you're teaching people to critically think, not telling them what to think. You're teaching them history, you're teaching them communication skills so they can parse arguments. Lori Hobart, my colleague, says, we read well to write well. That's a liberal art. And why do we care about writing well? Because that's how we make persuasive arguments. That's what we need to be teaching, because that's the route to civic success. That's my response there. Not propaganda, the ability to critically think and critically communicate.
And I think I would say that the new legislation would embrace that. It would do two things that you've mentioned are key. And one is to increase at the national level funding for civics and history so that they get the same attention that STEM topics do now, but specifically avoiding the need to prescribe any curriculum, recognizing that standards are really set at the state level. Tia Johnson, I'd like to come to you for a minute, if I might. I mentioned the testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee yesterday. The Commission on Military, National, and Public Service was a very impressive effort, 2 years. I think something like 4,300 comments received, 350 private organizations talked to it. It was really a very comprehensive engagement with the public. Among the comments they make is that something like 0.5% of Americans currently have experience with active service in the military. And so it's an increasingly smaller part of the population. They also stress the point that there are too few opportunities for public service outside of the military. I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on how you think that kind of an increased opportunity to engage, even in student years, might be valuable.
Thank you. Yes, you're correct. The report entitled "Inspired to Serve" had multiple recommendations in various categories, and one of the areas that we're talking about was the best practices in civic education and service, what they call service learning. And they're stressing the importance of incorporating both civics education, which Judge Baker just spoke about, but also the other component of service learning in K through 12 education, as well as in higher education. And service learning then would be those opportunities, as you mentioned, to get students out of the classroom, to be able to translate the things that they learned in the classroom and put it into action. And so, you know, youth programs, or even plugging into pre-existing programs, would, again, inculcate them with this sense of service. When I was still on active duty, I used to keep a sign under my desk, you know, we used to have the glass on the desk. And it said, you know, that with every, you know, privilege, there's a responsibility. With every right comes a responsibility. And I think that part of what we are seeing is that disconnect, that cognitive dissonance between a right. People say, oh, it's my right to do whatever, but they don't understand that as a citizen of the United States, they also have responsibilities, and that they must perform those responsibilities. And so the whole idea behind the recommendations that the commission makes is to try to embed that into particularly K through 12, that they will then come out of, have opportunities during that period, and then more importantly, come out and maybe go into one of the national service programs, you know, kind of like a Peace Corps, a domestic Peace Corps, as it were. We saw that with the, is it Teach for America? As one of the programs. Of course, we have the traditional programs wherein in the health department, when people went into public health and went to some of the state, local, or tribal areas to practice. So that's what the commission is recommending, increasing those types of opportunities as a bridge. So to give students both the foundational knowledge, as Judge Baker talked about, and then operationalize that by allowing them to implement it through one of these vehicles.
Terrific. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. You know, it seems to me there's a role here for all parts of our society to play. And Jen O'Connor, if I could come to you now that you're in the private sector and with a substantial corporate entity, in 2019, November, I guess it was, the Chamber of Public Commerce, pardon me, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, came out with a very important report that they co-authored with Harvard. And they talked about the business case for civic education. I wonder whether you could share your views as to whether you think there's a role for our private sector to play, large corporations, small corporations, in embracing this problem and its solutions.
I do. And I just want to share one thought that I had about your sort of introduction to the testimony yesterday and the report. And I was also struck by this when I was listening to what Tia was saying. One of the things that this made me think about is that, you know, it used to be that we had a much broader, more diverse sort of portion of the population who had a member of the family serve in the military at some capacity at some time. And so they had a sort of natural understanding of what it does, and also it served as an inspiration to join either in uniform or as civilians or in other ways. And I think you still find that many of the people who put on a uniform come from a family where there is somebody in their family who already did that. And, you know, that isn't enough. It's not, for one thing, it's not diverse enough, right? Diverse in every sense of, you know, perspectives of background, of perspective, of geography, and you need all of that diversity for good decision making. So, you know, I think one of the most important goals of enhancing civic education is to really enhance the understanding of the military and what service in the military is, and to inspire a broader set of young people to want to serve. And I was also struck that it's true in the legal field very much. You know, when I was at DOD, and still now, when I talk to law students, I tell them that service in the JAG Corps is a terrific career path. It's great experience, it's a great job, you get to serve. And this isn't something that everybody hears about in law school, you know, as a career path, but it's a terrific career path. And we need more of them to explore it. And they need to know what it is and why it's attractive and all of that. So that's kind of a part of this. And I think in terms of the question of the private sector and its role, it's very varied. I mean, I work at a large organization who has, you know, national security as part of its mission, because that's what its customers are engaged in, and hires many, many, many people who come from the prior government careers in the area of defense and national security. And it's tremendously beneficial to have that experience. But it's also very important in terms of what we do to understand what the government's aims are and the responsibilities that come with that, and the, you know, structure and framework that surrounds it. And so having a well-informed set of employees who are serving private institutions, you know, is as important as having well-informed employees who are serving public institutions. It's all, it all kind of comes together. And, you know, and as I said earlier, we're all part of communities where we live. And so companies have a role to play in terms of encouraging dialogue and understanding and community engagement among their employees, because we're part of the communities in which we work.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm getting some terrific questions here, and I think maybe what I'll do, Steve Brunel, is to ask you to handle one of them. One person wants to know, what during your government service did you do to lead by example and, if you will, foster civic lessons? And adding to that, what do you think that current national security leaders themselves ought to be doing to improve understanding of the importance of civics? And I would say here that although we've been talking about K through 12, or maybe even K through 22 if you add law schools, a big part of our population is out of school, and we've got to address them as well, because I think what our survey results will tell us is that this decline in civic education didn't happen just overnight. It's been a 5-decade process, probably dating back even to the time when we first saw that we had a, or shall we say, a gap in our STEM education as a result of the Sputnik launch. So this has been something that has been building over time. So Steve, if you would, could you say a little bit about what kind of leadership opportunities you saw while in government to promote civics among both, I think, the government workforce as well as the public that you importantly point out it's our goal to serve?
Yeah, I love the point about sort of continuing civics education, as it were. I think that was kind of what you were suggesting. And just to link it back to sort of my concern with technology and its impact on these issues. This was something I worried a lot about when I was at the Homeland Security Department, and we did both internally and externally launch what we call the cyber literacy program, which was to try to inform people both inside the government and outside the government about the cybersecurity risks, and the fact that so much of our lives are now reflected in data, and the security of that data is really fundamental to our collective security. But what's interesting when you think about education is we have more grandparents in the United States than we have grandchildren right now. So the population that is probably most in need of say greater tech literacy to protect them against, say, misinformation and some of the other threats that we were talking about, Director Wray talked about, are not the school kids when it comes to the technology risks. It's older people. It's my parents who are perhaps a little bit too trusting of emails that are too good to be true, and happy to click on them without thinking twice. And so the collective effect of ignorance at that level is a big deal. So that was something that we tried to do at the Homeland Security Department. There are opportunities to do a lot more of that, sort of public service education that make us all stronger. It's really kind of an analogy to a public health education campaign.
That's very helpful. A couple of questions want to know, I think building on that, what the national security legal community can and should be doing to engage more at all levels in addressing this problem. And I think maybe I'll just make that the last question and let each of you make a quick comment if you would. And maybe I'll go right back to the beginning and start with you, Jamie Baker.
Thank you very much. I guess I would respond first. We all have an obligation to get out and communicate, and to say that law is not a specialty. You don't need to go to law school to understand law or to value law. It is who we are as a nation. It's our defining characteristic. If you're a Lance Corporal in the military, you're supposed to understand the law and follow it, including the law of armed conflict. So lesson number one is to make the law accessible to all, as accessible as it can possibly be. And that starts with an understanding of the Constitution as a procedural document and its underpinning of our democracy. So that's our task as teachers. We're all teachers there. Think big is the second point, rather than small. Lawyers get burdened down by the specific tasks they are performing, but we have to always think big and remind people of the greater whole, that it all adds up to a greater whole. And I'm sitting here, I love Steve's comment about public health education in the technology area. I'm living proof, perhaps I'm not living proof, but you can learn new technologies even as you get older. And one of the things law schools should be teaching, which they're not, and this goes back to grumping about the ABA and its standards, is law schools are not teaching technology or requiring it to be taught. They're teaching the rule of perpetuities, and what they should be teaching is artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Tia, let me come to you.
Well, since Judge Baker threw out the gauntlet, what I was going to address, going back to what we can do, I was going to give some examples of what Georgetown Law Center has been doing, and they're committed to doing. It has had the street law program for a very long time. And for those who aren't familiar with it, those are programs that are embedded in law schools that go out and they're teaching these types of ideas, these types of concepts in high school classes. It's an old program. I did it when I was in law school, and we were chiseling our notes on the rocks. So, but Georgetown has a very robust street law program. Also, similarly, the university started about a couple of years ago what they call their early outreach initiative, and that's reaching into the high schools who may not be in the street law program, but reaching into the high schools in the public school districts that are surrounding Washington, D.C. So particularly the Maryland districts and the Northern Virginia districts. And it's the same type of thing, but they bring them into the law school and we do instruction with them. So I've been involved in that early outreach initiative. And that's the same idea as both Steve and Judge Baker have noted, to help them to understand that the Constitution is not this disembodied thing, that is the very lifeblood of our nation, that is the structure of our government, that it's our system of governance. And what does that mean? And then how does that impact them in their daily lives? And so that's very important. And then again, in the law school instruction, embedding these ideas. I mean, I teach within the national security law realm. So, I mean, I teach a course on congressional oversight. And again, it's all about, Article 1, Article 2 powers, and how that tension, and how the Article 3 courts have to come in and get involved in that process. And so it is important to teach this at all levels, and the whole idea of, yes, continuing education. That, I think that that's also vitally important, because more importantly, that's that generation that is the most likely to be the most active voters. They're the ones who are going to probably be more likely to try to hold their elected representatives accountable. So we want them to also exercise critical thinking skills, and not to buy into, as Steve said, you get the email and you click it and you believe it, or I read it on Facebook, so it must be true. So that's one of the things that that Georgetown in particular is trying to do in furthering civic education at the high school, undergraduate. Oh yeah, we have the boot camp. I'm sorry. That's how we reach out to the undergraduates. That's the boot camp, and then certainly within law school.
That's great. So Jen O'Connor, I want to come to you, and I just want to say that your comment about the JAG Corps resonated for me. I have the zeal of a converted too. I grew up at a time when I thought the military was a junk item, and then I met the JAG Corps and I thought, oh dear, I think I got that wrong. They're terrific, and it is a good career path. But any things you would like to add as to what we ought to be doing as either current or past national security lawyers to try and engage these topics?
I think we all have opportunities to talk with groups of people who are not national security lawyers, right? And I think taking those opportunities to talk about what we did, what we do, what our experiences are, and what the lawyers who work in national security and what the national security part of the government does generally is important. I think the street law, I love that comment in that program. It's great. And programs where it doesn't have to be like a full-blown program, but opportunities to do a one-day talk with high school students, or be part of a mentor program where you meet a small number of students, and not just students in high school, but also students in college and beyond that in law school. I think sort of shedding light and helping people to understand it will help to bring them into it. And I think it's very important, I think, and I think some of the things that the commission report talked about in terms of having more opportunities for people to spend a couple of years in sort of a Peace Corps type, National Service Corps type, AmeriCorps type program where they can participate, I think that's critical. And I think the national security lawyer kind of role can be to help encourage people to do that kind of thing by helping them understand what this piece of the world is all about.
Great. Well, that's helpful too. And finally, Steve, I'm going to give you, I think, the last word here. Thoughts from you on what those who've had national security law experiences, certainly you have at DHS and are now in the private sector, ought to be doing to help educate people on these topics?
Well, I have sort of two thoughts. One is just to echo Jamie's, he's been very eloquent on this, about each of us having a duty, a personal duty to pay it forward. And in whatever ways are available to you. Could be street law, could be law school, could be something in between. And so that's one. I think the other thing, and I remember back to elementary school, being assigned to recite by memory President Kennedy's inauguration speech, or at least parts of it, the part that included, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I think a lot of this is leadership, and we need a narrative. Judge Baker is absolutely right. History is the key. We are hardwired as human beings to respond to stories. That's what pull us together. I think one of the things we're missing in this country are unifying stories. We need to have stories that speak to everybody, not just to some segments of our country. Can't gloss over the ugly parts of history, but you can present them alongside with the optimistic parts of our culture and of our country, and that's really what we need to do collectively. But also at the very top, the people who are influential in our government need to articulate a unifying story that we can all get around. That's optimistic and inspiring. That's how you get collective action.
Well, this has been a wonderful panel, and I hope I don't put words into your mouths, but I think everybody in your comments suggests that we do have a problem with inadequate attention to civic education and history, and that we ignore this at our peril. And certainly that's one of the reasons why we as national security lawyers think this is a topic that we ought to be raising in the national security communities that we are familiar and engaged with. And so I thank you for the time you've taken to explore some of the possible solutions and your perspectives. I'd like to give Suzanne Spalding the last word here. Suzanne, are you with us? And would you just do a wrap-up comment or two? I want to be true to our commitment to keep this to an hour and a half, and I think we're just about a minute over.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for an outstanding panel. And I want to be sure to thank as well the ABA Standing Committee on Law and National Security, who was a partner in putting this panel together with us. Just so many wonderful highlights from all of you, but I was particularly struck, Jamie, by your talk about the need for government employees, officials to understand the why of our laws, those fundamental values and principles. And Tia, as you talked about it, particularly important for young military recruits coming in, right, to understand the nature of the oath. And then your comment about the civilization being a thin veneer, which I remember Jack Marsh, former Secretary of the Army, used to talk about. Steve, I thought your comments, particularly about the interplay of technology and civics, were really interesting. And for those who may also find that interesting, you might want to check out the interview that we did with Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, where he went on at some length about the importance of civics in the tech community. And Jen, your discussion about the role of business and the way in which they need to encourage dialogue and engagement among their employees as part of their civic responsibility to the communities of which they are a part, right? And all of you who talked about the importance of going out then and talking to the public, the role that, the responsibility that each of us has, particularly as lawyers and national security community, national security lawyers. And I want to say, I think you have done, you have done that with this panel. It was really just so outstanding, a contribution to civic education that I think should be required viewing in general counsel's offices all across government, certainly in national security departments and agencies. And we will certainly be posting this, but I want to thank you all for a terrific discussion. Elizabeth, great job in guiding that. And thanks to all of you who tuned in. Take care, everybody.